On a cold February night in 1943, off a jungle beach in the South Pacific, a Japanese sailor reached down from the deck of a destroyer to help a soldier climb aboard. The soldier could not lift his own arms. He had no strength left in his hands, so the sailor bent down, put his arms under the man's shoulders, and pulled him up like a sack of rice, because that was what the soldier now weighed. He was one of 10,652 men that Japan carried off the island that week. 6 months earlier, the Empire had sent 36,000 of its finest soldiers to take that island. 25,000 of them never came home. And 3 out of every 4 who died there were not killed by an American bullet. They starved. They died in the mud, waiting for supplies from an empire that could no longer reach them, while the enemy, they had been told, was too soft to fight, too pampered to bleed, too spoiled to endure a hard war, kept coming, kept fighting, kept rebuilding the runway they tried to destroy. For 187 days. The name of the island was Guadalcanal, and this is the story of the American Marines who broke a myth that had guided an empire for a generation. It is the story of a boy from New Jersey who carried a machine gun through 200 yards of gunfire because his brothers were dying. It is the story of a red-haired lieutenant colonel who stood on a wooden box in front of exhausted men and asked them, quietly, for one more night. And it is the story of the moment an emperor in Tokyo asked a simple question about a runway, and not one general in his high command could give him an answer. Sit with me. This one deserves your time. In the summer of 1942, the Japanese Empire believed it had discovered a secret about the American soul. The secret was this: Americans were soft. Americans were pampered. Americans were creatures of comfort who feared death, worshipped machines, and would break the moment they were asked to bleed. This was not the opinion of a few generals. This was the operational doctrine of the Imperial Japanese Army. It was taught in officer academies. It was printed in pamphlets and distributed to enlisted men. It was preached from radios and pulpits and parade grounds across a nation that had just conquered 1/7 of the globe in 6 months. They had a name for the feeling that swept through their high command that summer. They called it Senshobyo, victory disease, and it was killing. To understand what happened on a wet, malarial island in the Solomon Chain between August of 1942 and February of 1943, you first have to understand the myth that was about to die. Because Guadalcanal was not simply a battle. Guadalcanal was the burial ground of an idea, and the idea was that spirit could defeat steel. The Japanese had a word for spirit, seishin. It meant something more than courage. It meant the interior fire of a warrior race, the accumulated inheritance of centuries of Bushido, the willingness to die that turned a man into a weapon no material force could stop. Prime Minister Fumimaro Kono had declared it plainly on NHK radio in October of 1937. Western people, he said, were materialistic. Japanese people were spiritual. Japanese people were more sacred, more sincere, more clean. War Minister Hideki Tojo had put the doctrine in writing in January of 1941 in the Shinjunkun, the field service code carried by every Japanese soldier. Do not consider death, it commanded. Do not fear it. The spirit will carry you through. By the summer of 1942, this was not rhetoric. This was faith, and the faith seemed to be working. Singapore had fallen to a Japanese force less than half the size of its British garrison. The Philippines had crumbled. The Dutch East Indies had collapsed in 3 months. Burma was overrun. Everywhere the Imperial Army marched, the Western enemy folded exactly as doctrine had promised. A pamphlet distributed to Japanese infantry that year, titled The Psychology of the American Individual, spelled out what to expect when the moment finally came to meet the Americans in real ground combat. Americans, the pamphlet explained, had no thought for the glory of their actions. Americans feared death. Americans were daredevils in search of publicity who could not sustain themselves when separated from their comfortable material world. Take away their luxuries, and they would break. This is what Japanese officers told their men in the summer of 1942. Wait until you meet them face to face. You will see them fall. There was one man in Tokyo who did not believe. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto was 58 years old that summer. He was the commander of the Combined Fleet, the architect of Pearl Harbor, the most feared and most decorated naval officer in the empire. He was also something else. He was one of the very few senior Japanese leaders who had actually lived in the country he was now at war with. Between 1919 and 1921, Yamamoto had studied at Harvard University. He had traveled by rail across the American continent. He had toured the automobile factories of Detroit. He had walked through the oil refineries of Tenaru. He had seen with his own eyes the shipyards and steel mills and assembly lines of a nation whose industrial capacity was still, in the 1920s, only beginning to reach its full stride. And he had done the arithmetic. In a letter to Prime Minister Kono, written before the war began, Yamamoto had put down words that would haunt him for the rest of his short life. In the first 6 to 12 months of a war with the United States and Great Britain, he had written, "I will run wild and win victory upon victory. But then, if the war continues after that, I have no expectation of success." He had said this before Pearl Harbor. He had said it while planning Pearl Harbor. He had said it to the men who would decide whether Japan went to war. And they had listened, and they had nodded, and they had ignored. Because the ideology was stronger than the arithmetic. Because Seishin was supposed to defeat steel. Because a warrior nation did not calculate, it believed. Here is the first great irony of Guadalcanal. The man who understood America best was the man whose warnings were never heeded. And by the summer of 1942, even Yamamoto himself had begun to fall into the trap. Presenting the Pearl Harbor Plan, he had expressed a hope that the devastation of the American Pacific Fleet would leave the American people so dispirited they would not. He had understood American factories. What he had failed to understand was American will. That failure of imagination was about to be corrected in the mud of an island most Japanese officers could not have found on a map 3 months earlier. The island was called Guadalcanal. It was 90 miles long, 25 miles wide, covered in dense jungle, ringed by beaches of black volcanic sand, and populated primarily by crocodiles, mosquitoes, and the microorganisms that carried malaria into every living body that spent more than a few nights. The Japanese had come to Guadalcanal in the middle of 1942 for a single practical reason. They wanted to build an airfield. From an airfield on Guadalcanal, Japanese bombers could reach the shipping lanes between the United States and Australia. If those lanes were cut, Australia could be strangled. If Australia was strangled, the American counteroffensive in the South Pacific would have no launching pad. The airfield was, in every sense, the key to the southern flank of the war. The Americans understood this. They understood it late, and they understood it in a hurry. On the American side, the war planners were still assembling. The 1st Marine Division, the unit that would be asked to seize the island, was scattered across the Pacific. The 7th Marines were in Samoa. The 5th Marines had only just landed at Wellington in New Zealand in June. The 1st Marines were not scheduled to arrive until July. Their supplies were incomplete. Their intelligence was inadequate. Their knowledge of jungle warfare was, to put it charitably, theoretical. They were commanded by a 55-year-old Virginian named Alexander Vandegrift. Vandegrift was not a flamboyant man. He was not the sort of general who filled the newspapers or thundered from. He was quiet, methodical, deliberate. He was a career officer who had spent his life in the Marine Corps. And he understood exactly what his division was being asked to do, and exactly how thin the margin for error would be. When the operation was drawn up in Washington, someone gave it a formal name: Operation Watchtower. The men who had to carry it out gave it a different name. They called it Operation Shoestring, because that was what they were going to be hanging from. On the morning of the 7th of August, 1942, roughly 11,000 American Marines waded ashore on Guadalcanal. The landing was at first almost anticlimactic. The Japanese force on the island was mostly not so. It was a construction unit, around 2,800 Korean and Japanese laborers building the airfield, protected by a small garrison. When the American landing craft appeared out of the dawn, the construction workers dropped their tools and fled into the jungle, leaving behind bowls of rice still warm on the tables. The Americans walked into a half-finished airstrip and named it after a Marine aviator who had died at Midway 2 months earlier. His name was Lofton Henderson. And Henderson Field would, over the next 6 months, become the most contested piece of real estate on the surface. Tokyo, when the news reached Imperial General Headquarters, the reaction was disbelief. Not disbelief that the Americans had come, disbelief at the scale. Japanese planners had assumed that any American counteroffensive was at least 12 months away. It had been 8 months since Pearl Harbor. A full division of Marines could not possibly be on Guadalcanal. It had to be a raid. A reconnaissance in force, a few thousand men who would soon withdraw. Tokyo was wrong, And Tokyo would remain wrong, catastrophically wrong, about the size and the character of the American force for months to come, because Japanese intelligence from this moment forward would not be gathering facts, it would be gathering confirmation. Every report would be filtered through the idea. They saw what they wanted to see, and it killed them. But before any of that could begin, something happened in the water off Guadalcanal on the second night after the landings that would change the entire character of the campaign. Something that the Americans on the beach did not learn about until it was over. Something that would leave 11,000 Marines standing on a jungle island with almost no food, almost no ammunition, and no. Just after midnight on the 9th of August 1942, in the dark passage of water between Guadalcanal and the smaller island of Savo, a Japanese cruiser force under Vice Admiral Genichi Mikawa found the Allied screening force asleep at its guns. What followed happened in about 30 minutes. 4 Allied heavy cruisers, Astoria, Quincy, Vincent, and the Australian ship Canberra were caught in a converging series of Japanese torpedo and gun attacks that they never saw coming. The Japanese had trained for years in night gunnery. Their optics were superior. Their torpedoes, the terrible Type 93 Long Lance, ran faster and farther than anything in the American arsenal, and they ran in silence. In the space of half an hour, all 4 Allied cruisers were burning red. More than 1,077 Allied sailors died in the water that night. Canberra was scuttled the next morning. Astoria sank the following afternoon. It was the worst defeat in a fair fight in the history of the United States Navy. And here is the terrible thing. Mikawa, having won this stunning victory, could have turned his cruisers south and shelled the defenseless American transport ships still unloading at Guadalcanal. Those transports carried everything the Marines on the beach needed to survive. Food, ammunition, medical supplies, heavy equipment. If Mikawa had struck them, the campaign would have been over before it began. But Mikawa, worried about American aircraft that would come at dawn, chose to withdraw. He steamed back toward Rabaul with his ships intact and his victory secure. His victory, that was the strange word for what had just happened, because in tactical terms, Mikawa had won one of the most one-sided naval engagements of the war, and in strategic terms, he had achieved nothing. But the Marines on the beach did not know any of this yet. What they knew was what they saw on the morning of the 9th of August and on the mornings after. They saw the American transport ships weighing anchor and steaming away over the horizon. They saw the escort carriers turning south. They saw the fleet that was supposed to feed them and arm them and shell the jungle for them, disappearing. The Marines were being abandoned. Vandegrift stood on the beach and watched the ships go and understood, in that moment, exactly what had happened to him. He had 11,000 men on an island in the middle of enemy waters. He had perhaps a few weeks of food if he stretched it. He had ammunition for a limited engagement, not for a siege. And he had no way of knowing when or whether any of it would be replaced. He gave the only order he could give. He ordered his men onto Japanese rice. For the first weeks of the Guadalcanal campaign, American Marines ate the enemy's food. They ate the rice and the dried fish that the fleeing Japanese construction workers had left behind. They dug into Japanese supply dumps and pulled out whatever they could carry. They cut their rations in half and then in half again. They looked out at the empty ocean where the fleet had been, and they got to work with what they had. They dug fighting holes into the coral. They strung barbed wire along the beach. They finished the airfield the Japanese had started. They positioned machine guns to cover every avenue of approach and pre-registered artillery on every likely angle of attack. Because the Marines understood, even before Tokyo did, that the Japanese were coming for them. And in Tokyo, the men who were about to come for them were still, at this moment, reading intelligence reports that said the landing on Guadalcanal was a raid. A few thousand Americans at most. Soft men, materialistic men, men who would fold at the first bayonet. The first officer chosen to sweep them away was a 50-year-old veteran of the war in China, a former instructor at the Imperial Army Infantry School, a man who had built his career on a fondness for the night attack and a very low opinion of the American Marine. His name was Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki, and he was on his way. Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki landed at Taivu Point on the 19th of August, 1942, with 916 men, 7 days of rations, and absolute certainty. The certainty was the most dangerous thing he carried. Ichiki had been briefed at Truk before sailing. The briefing was clear. The American force on Guadalcanal might be as large as 10,000 men. He was to land, hold his position, wait for his second echelon of 1,100 additional troops, and coordinate with Major General Kawaguchi's brigade of another 6,000. Only then, with combined strength, was he to move against Henderson Field. Ichiki heard the briefing, and Ichiki decided to ignore every word. He was 50 years old. He had fought in China. He had taught infantry tactics at the Imperial Army School. He had watched the British and the Dutch and the Australians fold across a hemisphere of conquest. He had been told all his life that Americans were softer than any of them, and now he had been given the honor of proving it. He was not going to share that honor with reinforcements. He was going to take Henderson Field with the men he had, on the timeline he chose, and he was going to do it in 2 nights. His men carried 7 days of rations because Ichiki did not believe they would need more than 2. Think about that number. 7 days. 916 men against a defensive perimeter that might hold 10,000. And he thought 7 days was generous. This was not stupidity. This was blind faith, plain and simple. Ichiki genuinely believed that when his men crossed the sand and screamed their battle cry and closed with the bayonet, the American line would simply come apart. He had been told this his entire career. He was about to prove it one final time for the whole empire to see. On the night of the 20th of August, Ichiki sent a small patrol forward to feel out the American positions. The patrol was detected. There was a brief, sharp exchange of fire on the sand. 3 Marines died, 3 Japanese soldiers. And when the survivors of the patrol crawled back to their lines, they carried with them the one piece of information that should have stopped the entire attack. The Americans were not asleep. The Americans were not running. The Americans were waiting. Ichiki was told this. Ichiki heard it, and Ichiki gave the order anyway. At 1:30 in the morning on the 21st of August, a green flare climbed into the sky over a stretch of black sand at the mouth of a creek the Marines had wrongly identified as the Tenaru River. The name was wrong. The geography would be corrected by historians later, but the name stuck because the men who fought there called it that, and the men who fought there earned the naming rights. The flare burned, and in its light the Marines on the far bank saw it. 900 Japanese soldiers in mass formation, rifles up, bayonets fixed, charging across the sandbar in a single screaming wave. They came exactly the way doctrine said to come. They came the way Japanese officers had been taught to lead men for 2 generations. They came with the assumption that the moment the American line saw them, the American line would break. The American line did not. Behind that line, in prepared positions, waited the 2nd Battalion, 1st Marines, under Lieutenant Colonel Edwin Paul. Waited 237mm anti-tank guns, and this is where the story becomes something the Japanese doctrine had never described. Each of those anti-tank guns was loaded, not with an armor-piercing shell, but with a canister round. A canister round was a shotgun shell for artillery. Inside each one, packed like seeds in a fruit, sat 128 lead balls, each of them designed to fly outward in a spreading cone at the speed of sound. 2 guns, 256 lead balls per volley, aimed at a narrow sandbar full of men. Behind the guns waited machine guns already registered on every foot of the cross. And behind the machine guns, pre-plotted, waited 75 and 105mm artillery, targeted on the exact patch of sand the Japanese were now standing on. The first wave of about 100 men was cut down in minutes. The canister rounds tore holes through the formation faster than the men behind could close them. The machine guns swept the sand in interlocking lanes of fire. The artillery fell where it had been told to fall. The second wave came anyway, 150 men. Perhaps 200. They walked over their own dead. They ran into the same guns. They died in the same lanes. At 5 in the morning, still convinced the American line must be about to break, a group of Japanese soldiers waded out into the ocean and tried to come around the flank through. They were met by machine gun crews who had sighted their weapons for exactly this contingency months in advance. The water turned dark. And then at dawn, something happened that the Japanese doctrine did not have a page for. The Americans came out from behind their line. Lieutenant Colonel Leonard Creswell's 1st Battalion, 1st Marines, crossed the creek upstream, moved through the jungle, and came down behind the surviving Japanese from the south. Four M3 Stuart light tanks from Company B, 1st Tank Battalion, rolled onto the sandbar and drove straight into the coconut grove where the remains of the Ichiki detachment were still trying to reorganize. Japanese soldiers threw themselves at the tanks. They tried to stop them with their bodies. The tanks kept moving. Overhead, Wildcats and Dauntlesses from Henderson Field, that same airfield the Japanese had come to seize, strafed the retreating survivors. There was no mercy. The Marines had already seen what Japanese soldiers did to prisoners in other places, in other jungles. They had already seen wounded Japanese soldiers wait for corpsmen to approach and then pull the pins on hidden grenades. They had already learned this war was not going to have quarter. By 5 in the afternoon on the 21st of August, the sandbar was silent. 789 of Ichiki's 917 men were dead. 15 wounded were taken prisoner. American casualties were 34 killed and 75 wounded. Ichiki himself, according to most accounts, burned his regimental colors, the sacred banner of his lineage, and then took his own life. Some Japanese survivors insisted later that he had been killed in the fighting. The truth of his last hour has never been settled. But one thing was certain. The elite detachment that had crossed half an ocean to prove the softness of the American Marine had proved the opposite and had ceased to exist while doing it in the space of a single night. And then came the moment that told you everything about how the Empire had chosen to see the world. When the survivors radioed back to Rabaul that the first echelon of the Ichiki detachment had been almost annihilated, headquarters staff read the report and refused to believe it. Lieutenant Colonel Hiroshi Matsumoto at the 17th Army Command Post called it a fall. 2 days later, headquarters was still telling itself that Ichiki's force was intact and pressing toward Henderson Field. The bodies on the sandbar were already beginning to bloat in the tropical sun, and Tokyo was still discussing the imminent capture of the airstrip. The book had no page. Rear Admiral Raizo Tanaka, the man who would later command the desperate destroyer Runs into Guadalcanal, wrote about the Tenaru afterward with a bitterness that never left. This tragedy, he said, should have taught us the hopelessness of bamboo spear tactics. It taught them nothing. It taught them nothing because the officers who might have listened were about to make exactly the same mistake on exactly the same island. At 3 times the scale. His name was Kiyotake Kawaguchi. He was 50 years old. He was a major general. He commanded the 35th Infantry Brigade. He had 6,000 men. He believed there were 2,000 Marines on Guadalcanal. There were more than 12,000. Kawaguchi had prepared for what he assumed would be his moment of triumph with a very particular touch. He had brought in his personal luggage a set of dress, the formal parade uniform of a Japanese general. He intended to wear them at the ceremony where Vandegrift would offer his sword. Kawaguchi never got. On the 8th of September, a battalion of Marine Raiders and paratroopers under Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Edson landed at a place called Tasimboko in a preemptive raid on the Japanese supply base behind Kawaguchi's staging area. They shot up the camp, they wrecked the supplies, they set fire to what they could not carry. And in the ruins of the officers' baggage, they found the dress whites. They took the whites back with them to Henderson Field. They tied them to a flagpole, and they raised them like a captured colors above the airstrip Kawaguchi had come to take. He was going to have to take it in the field uniform after all. On the nights of the 12th, 13th, and 14th of September, Kawaguchi threw the main body of his brigade, roughly 3,000 men, up a long jungle ridge that ran south of Henderson Field. The ridge was the last piece of high ground before the airstrip itself. If it fell, the airstrip fell. If the airstrip fell, Guadalcanal. The man who held the ridge was a lieutenant colonel named Merritt Austin. Edson was 45 years old. He was a red-haired, sunburned New Englander who had spent his career fighting in places no one back home could find on a map. He had won the Navy Cross in Nicaragua in 1928, patrolling the Coco River against Sandino. He had trained his raiders, the men who would fight beside him on this ridge, harder and longer than any conventional infantry unit in the Corps. Men called him Red Mike. They followed him because when things got worst, he was where the fire was. On that ridge, on those 3 nights, things got worst. Kawaguchi's men came screaming out of the jungle. They came in mass formations, in bayonet charges, exactly as doctrine. They came in the darkness with their rifles held high and their battle cries splitting the night, expecting again that the Americans on the high ground would break under the sheer psychological weight of the assault. The Americans on the high ground did not break. Edson walked his lines all night, under fire. He moved from position to position, calm, deliberate, correcting a machine gun's field of fire here, steadying a young rifleman there, disappearing for a moment into the smoke and reappearing at another point on the line. The men who fought under him that night would remember for the rest of their lives the sight of Red Mike simply walking through the killing ground as if the bullets did not concern him personally. Forward observers from the 11th Marines called down artillery so close to the American positions that Marines could feel the shells passing overhead. 1,992 rounds of 105mm fire fell that night, some of them landing within 200 yards of Edson's own line. The concussion beat the ground like a fist. The Japanese kept coming. In the afternoon, between the first and second nights, with his exhausted men lying flat in their holes, Edson stood on a wooden grenade box in front of them. He was a small man to look at. Nothing about him promised what he was going to say. "You men have done a great job," he told them, "and I have just one more thing to ask of you. Hold out just one more night." They held. By dawn on the 14th, Japanese soldiers had penetrated to within a few dozen yards of the airstrip itself, and the American line, thinner than it should have been, holding on with men who had not slept in 2 days, did not give way. Later, describing that fight, Alexander Vandegrift would say something remarkable. He would say that in the entire 6-month campaign, this was the only time he genuinely doubted the outcome. This ridge, this night, the ridge held. When the sun came up on the 14th of September, more than 600 Japanese lay dead on the slopes and in the ravines below. Kawaguchi's brigade had lost roughly 1,500 men. The raiders and paratroopers had lost 57 killed and 232 wounded. Kawaguchi, retreating into the jungle with the shattered remains of his brigade, would carry a sentence with him for the rest of his life. He wrote it later. Guadalcanal, he said, is no longer merely the name of an island in Japanese military history. It is the name of the graveyard of the Japanese army. Kawaguchi had learned. Kawaguchi understood. His superiors did not. 6 weeks after Bloody Ridge, Lieutenant General Harukichi Hyakutake, commander of the 17th Army, landed personally on Guadalcanal to take charge. He was 54 years old. He had determined in the calm of his headquarters that the failures of Ichiki and Kawaguchi had come from insufficient force, not from any error in doctrine. He would bring more men. He would bring the elite 2nd Division, one of the finest units in the Imperial Army. He would bring 20,000 troops in total. He was told there were 10,000 Americans on the island. There were more than 23,000. Between the 23rd and the 26th of October, Hyakutake threw his army at Henderson Field in the largest Japanese ground assault of the entire campaign, and on a section of thin American line held by the 1st Battalion of the 7th Marines under Lieutenant Colonel Louis Puller, known throughout the Corps as Chesty. For the shape of his torso and the aggression in his voice, a sergeant named John Basilone made himself into something that would be talked about in Marine barracks for the next 100 years. Basilone was 25 years old. He had grown up in Raritan, New Jersey, the 6th of 10 children in an Italian-American family. Before the Marines, he had served in the Army in Manila, where the other soldiers had given him a nickname that stuck. Manila John. He had re-enlisted in the Corps in July of 1940 because he missed the life. On the ridge in front of Henderson Field in the driving rain, Manila John commanded 2 sections of water-cooled 30-caliber Browning machine guns. The Japanese came in waves. They came the way they always came. They came the way Doctrine Still, incredibly, told them to come. Basilone's guns fired until the barrels glowed. When one section of guns was knocked out, with 2 of his men dead and 3 wounded, Basilone gathered up an entire Browning heavy machine gun and its ammunition, well over 80 pounds of steel and belted rounds together, and carried the whole load 200 yards through continuous fire to reoccupy the silenced position. He opened up point blank into the next wave. The bodies piled in front of his gun so high that other Marines had to crawl forward and drag them out of the way, so his fields of fire would not be blocked. He fought for 3 days and 3 nights without sleep. When his ammunition ran out, he fought with a .45 pistol and a machete. By the time dawn came on the last of those nights, only Basilone and 2 other men from his entire section were still on their feet. He was credited with dozens of enemy dead. The real number was almost certainly higher. He received the Medal of Honor. He was the first enlisted Marine of the Second World War to be so decorated. And when it was pinned to his chest, he said something that was not the language of doctrine, and not the language of propaganda, and not the language of any recruiting poster. "Only part of this medal belongs to me," he said. "Pieces of it belong to the boys who are still on Guadalcanal." He was 26 years old when they pinned it on him. He came home to Raritan, New Jersey in the summer of 1943, and the whole town turned out. His mother, Dora, wept in the crowd. His father, Salvatore, the tailor who had come from Naples with nothing, stood beside her and could not speak. The Marine Corps wanted to keep him in the United States. They wanted to send him on bond tours, put him on posters, use his face to sell war bonds. He did that for a while. He married a Marine sergeant named Lena Riggi on the 10th of July, 1944, in a church in Oceanside, California. Then he asked to go back. He told them he wanted to be with his boys. They sent him to Iwo Jima. On the 19th of February, 1945, in the black volcanic sand of a beach called Red Beach 2, John Basilone was killed leading a machine gun section against a Japanese block. He was 28 years old. He had been married for 7 months. "Only part of this medal belongs to me." That was what he had said when they gave it to him. Pieces of it belong to the boys who are still on Guadalcanal. In the end, a piece of him stayed with them. 200 yards down the same line, on that same October night, a platoon sergeant named Mitchell Page was fighting his own. Page was 24 years old. He was the son of Serbian immigrants born in Charleroi, Pennsylvania. When he had tried to enlist in the Marines as an 18-year-old, the local recruiter had told him he was underage and underweight. So Page had walked and hitchhiked 200 miles to the recruiting station in Baltimore and enlisted. That was the kind of man. On the ridge that October night, Page commanded 33 men and 4 machine guns. The Japanese assault broke over his position in waves. His men were killed and wounded one by one. His machine gun crews went down. His riflemen went down. And Page found himself, at some point in the dark hours before dawn, the last man on his position still. He moved from gun to gun. He kept them firing. A Japanese soldier came at him with a bayonet and opened his left hand to the bone. Page killed the man with his K-bar knife and kept moving. When reinforcements finally reached him at dawn, Page did not sit down. He did not stop. He unclamped the barrel of a Browning machine gun from its tripod, wrapped ammunition belts around his shoulders, and walked downhill firing the weapon from his hip. "Fix bayonets," he shouted at the men behind him. "Follow me." 98 Japanese lay dead on the ridge that morning. 200 more in the ravine below. He also received the Medal of Honor. The October offensive cost the Japanese somewhere between 2,200 and 3,000 dead. Major General Yumasu, mortally wounded by rifle fire while leading his men forward. Colonel Toshiro Hiroyasu of the 16th Infantry and most of his staff. Colonel Masajiro Furimiya of the 29th. American losses across the entire battle were approximately 86 killed. It was the last serious ground offensive the Japanese would ever attempt on Guadalcanal. And now the jungle began to take its own toll on both sides, but especially on the men who had come to combat. Because the Tokyo Express, that ingenious system by which Rear Admiral Raizo Tanaka's fast destroyers slipped down the slot at night to reinforce the island, could carry men, but it could not carry enough food. A single cargo ship could deliver what 16 destroyer loads could not. Destroyers were not built to feed armies. And so, week by week, the men Tanaka landed at Cape Esperance found themselves waiting for supplies that never came. The Japanese soldiers on the island began to give it a new name. They wrote it with a specific character, Ga, the character for starvation, Gato, Starvation Island. Second Lieutenant Genjiro Inui of the 8th Independent Anti-Tank Gun Company began keeping a diary. It survives, translated into English by his son. The head swimming from starvation is really terrible. Cannot stand up without something to lean on. I toppled down once, had a few young buds of an areca palm tree. Probationary Officer K. Nakamura wrote, "On the 11th of November, I can hear the constant roar of guns from the direction of the front line. It seems as though our forces are not firing a single shot as they have no ammunition or rations." On the 21st of December, Nakamura wrote, "I did not even dream that we could eat things like these on Guadalcanal. Well, I guess I can die any time now." His last entry was dated the 7th of January 1943. It read, "I hope we will execute a night attack as I want to eat the enemy food." His diary was found on or near his body. A young officer named Yasuo Obi, one of the few who would survive to write about it later, recorded a calculation that the starving Japanese soldiers used on each other in the last months of the campaign. He called it a grim calculus. It went like this. A soldier who could still stand on his own 2 feet would live for 30 more days. A soldier who could no longer stand but could still sit up had 3 weeks. A soldier who urinated while lying down had 3 days. A soldier who could no longer speak had 2 days. Obi noted with horror that the calculation was almost always correct. The men on Starvation Island had learned to read their own deaths in their own bodies. And then, on the night of the 13th of October, the ideology that had led them here paid a visit to Henderson Field in a form none of the Americans on the ground would ever forget. 2 Japanese battleships, Kongo and Haruna, steamed into the waters off Guadalcanal in the black hours before dawn. They opened fire with their 14-inch main battery. They fired for 83 minutes without stopping. 973 shells, each one weighing well over 1,000 pounds, fell on the American perimeter around the airfield. 48 of the 90 American aircraft on the ground were destroyed. 41 men were killed. The runway was cratered. Fuel dumps burned. The Marines in their foxholes felt the earth heave and the pressure hammer their chests as each. Later, veterans would say it was the worst thing they experienced in the entire war. When the sun came up over the wreckage, the Japanese planners in Rabaul had every reason to believe that Henderson Field was finished. By afternoon, the runway was operational again. Because before the last shell had even stopped ringing in the ears of the men in the holes, the Seabees, the Navy construction battalions who worked alongside the Marines, were already out on the air. They filled the craters. They graded the surface. They pushed the burning aircraft to the edges. And by the middle of the day, the surviving planes of the Cactus Air Force, that motley collection of wildcats and dauntlesses named for the code word for Guadalcanal, were taking off again from the same strip the battleships had tried to erect. And this was the thing the doctrine could not process. The doctrine had prepared for Americans who broke. It had not prepared for Americans who repaired. It had prepared for enemies who could be shattered. It had not prepared for enemies who healed faster than the Empire could wound them. In Rabaul, the reports came in. Henderson Field is still out. American aircraft are still flying. The Marine perimeter is still holding. In Tokyo, on the 14th floor of the Imperial General Headquarters, an officer laid a fresh casualty report on the desk of a general who had promised the Emperor victory before Christmas. The general read the numbers. He read them again. And then he did something no Japanese officer had done in front of a subordinate in living memory. He put his face in his hands, because the numbers on that paper meant something that the doctrine had no page for, something that 700 years of Bushido had not prepared any man in that room to accept. The empire was loose, and the sea they had ruled since Tsushima in 1905 was about to be taken away from them in 3 nights of fire off a jungle island most of them still could not find on a map. By the middle of November of 1942, the war for Guadalcanal was no longer a war for a jungle. It was a war for the water around a jungle. Because every man Japan had on the island, every one of the starving skeletons in the mud, every one of the officers writing final entries in diaries that would be found on their bodies, every one of the survivors of Ichiki and Kawaguchi and Hyakutake was there because Japanese ships had brought them. And every rifle round, every grain of rice, every drop of medicine that had ever reached them had come across the same water. If the water was lost, the island was lost. If the island was lost, the myth was lost. And so, in the second week of November, the Empire staked everything on one last effort to break the American grip on the slot. They lost the water in 3 nights. On the night of the 12th of November, a Japanese force built around 2 battleships, Hiei and Kirishima, came down through the darkness with the mission of doing to Henderson Field what Kongo and Haruna had done a month earlier. This time, it did not shell fields it wanted to erase. This time, an American cruiser and destroyer force under 2 rear admirals, Daniel Callahan and Norman Scott, was waiting in the black water off Savo Island to meet them. What followed was not a naval battle in the sense that Annapolis or Iwo Jima taught the term. It was a knife fight in a dark hallway. The 2 forces came together at ranges as close as 2,500 yards, point blank. Sailors on either side could see the enemy ships with the naked eye, could see the shape of the bridge, the flash of the guns, the running lights that some ships in the confusion had not remembered to darken. Ships fired at ships, ships collided with ships, ships fired on their own ships. It was chaos, it was slaughter, it was the kind of engagement men fought when there was no time left to fight anything else. When the sun came up, both American rear admirals were dead. Daniel Callahan, killed on the bridge of the cruiser San Francisco. Norman Scott, killed on the bridge of the cruiser Atlanta. In the entire course of the Second World War, in every ocean across 4 years of surface fighting, only 2 American admirals were killed in a surface engagement. Both of them died that night, in the same battle, off the same island. But the battleship Hiei, savaged by American gunfire in the darkness, was crippled. And as she tried to limp away in the morning, the aircraft of the Cactus Air Force, that same battered flock that Congo and Haruna had tried to erase, rose from Henderson Field and finished her. She went down that day, the first Japanese battleship lost to enemy action in the war, and then on the night of the 14th came Willis Lee. Rear Admiral Willis Augustus Lee commanded the battleship Washington. He was a quiet, methodical man, a marksman, a student of gunnery. He had spent his career learning how to hit a target he could barely see. On the night of the 14th of November, in the same waters where Callahan and Scott had died 2 nights before, he did exactly that. Washington closed to 8,400 yards on the battleship Kirishima. She was undetected. Kirishima did not know Washington was there until Washington opened fire. At least 9 16-inch shells struck Kirishima in 7 minutes. Any one of them alone would have been catastrophic. 9 of them together were an execution. Kirishima's steering gear was destroyed. Her fire control. Her hull was torn open in places larger than a house. She circled helplessly in the dark, unable to maneuver, unable to fire back, and she sank that night in the waters between Savo and Cape Esperance. She was the first Japanese battleship ever sunk at night by an American battleship in a gunnery duel, and with her sank one more myth. The myth that the Imperial Japanese Navy owned the night. The myth that in the black hours when Western sailors were said to lose their nerve, the Japanese fleet could not be touched. Willis Lee, calm and precise and utterly deadly, had taken that myth to the bottom of Iron Bottom Sound in 7 minutes. But even those 2 nights were not the worst thing that happened to Japan in November of. The worst thing happened in daylight, because behind the covering force of battleships, Japan had sent 11 transport ships, and in the holds of those transports rode 7,000 men of the 38th Division. This was to be the reinforcement that would finally tip the balance on Guadalcanal. This was the wave of men that would arrive with the rifles and the rice and the artillery that Ichiki and Kawaguchi and Hyakutake had all. This was the answer to the American perimeter. The Cactus Air Force found them on the water at dawn on the 14th. For most of that day, the Wildcats and the Dauntlesses of Henderson Field, joined by aircraft from the carrier Enterprise, worked over that convoy in the open sea. The transports had almost no anti-aircraft cover. Their escorts could do nothing. And American pilots, flying sortie after sortie, landing to rearm and taking off again within minutes, sank ship after ship after ship in front of the eyes of the men in the water. Of the 11 transports, 7 were sunk, 4 were damaged so badly they had to beach themselves on Guadalcanal to unload what they could. Of the 7,000 men who had sailed for Guadalcanal that morning, only 2,000 to 3,000 ever reached it. And when they reached it, they arrived without their weapons, without their equipment, without the food they had been carrying to feed themselves and to feed the army that was waiting for them. And here is the terrible thing, the truly terrible. Those survivors wading out of the surf onto the beaches of Guadalcanal in the dawn light were not reinforcements anymore. They were not going to save the army on the island. They were mouths. They were extra mouths, arriving on a starving island to eat the rations of men who were already dying of hunger. The lifeboat had become the anchor. Every man Japan added to Guadalcanal from that day forward accelerated the death of the men already. And in the diaries of the survivors, in the entries written by lieutenants and probationary officers who would not live to see February, you can read the moment when they saw the new arrivals stumbling ashore and understood that the rescue was the killing. By the middle of December, Japanese soldiers on Guadalcanal were dying at a rate of 50 men a day from starvation and disease alone. The rice ration, which was supposed to be 800 grams per soldier per day, had fallen to 50 grams. Some units were receiving nothing at all. The men were eating grass. They were eating bark. They were eating the leather of their own equipment. Lieutenant Okijima wrote, on the 26th of December, after eating his meal, he died suddenly. This makes approximately the total losses we received in the occupation of Hong Kong and Japan. The Empire was losing whole campaigns of men on one island to Hungary. Lieutenant General Hyakutake, the same man who had promised Tokyo he would succeed where his subordinates had failed, sent a message home on the 23rd of December. It was the message of a broken man. No food available. We can no longer send out scouts. 17th Army now requests permission to break into the enemy's positions and die an honorable death rather than die of hunger in our own dung. He was not asking to attack. He was asking for permission to end it. And on the 31st of December, 1942, in the Imperial Palace in Tokyo, the Emperor Hirohito was brought a decision that no Japanese ruler had ever been asked to make in the history of the Pacific War: withdraw. He was asked to sign off on the evacuation of Guadalcanal. To abandon an island the Empire had staked its prestige on. To retreat, he signed, but he was not silent about it. He asked quietly and directly a question that his generals could not answer. He asked why it had taken the Imperial Japanese Army over a month to build an airfield that the Americans had completed in a matter of days. No one had an answer. There was no answer. The answer would have required admitting that the doctrine itself, the doctrine of spirit over steel, had been wrong from the beginning. That the enemy the Empire had called soft was in fact the enemy who could bulldoze a runway back into service between one bombardment and that the ideology that had brought Japan to Guadalcanal was the ideology that was going to leave Japan at Guadalcanal. The generals stood in front of the Emperor and had nothing to say. The order was passed down. Hyakutake, when he received it in the middle of January, could not bring himself to tell his men the truth. He told them instead that they were being repositioned. He called it a change in the disposition of troops for future offensive action. He knew it was a lie. He wrote privately that it was a very difficult task for the army to withdraw under existing circumstances. However, the orders of the Emperor must be carried out at any cost. The cost was the worst thing of all, because there were men on Guadalcanal who could not walk to the evacuation beach, men whose legs would not carry, men whose bodies had already crossed some line that no rescue could bring them back over. Those men were, in the words of the orders passed down through the units, encouraged to uphold the honor of the Imperial Army. Many of them did. In the huts and the clearings and the muddy field hospitals in the last week of January, wounded and starving Japanese soldiers took their own lives so their comrades would not have to carry. Their bones are still on that island. Some of them have never been found. The evacuation itself was called Operation K. It was executed on 3 nights, the 1st of February, the 4th of February, the 7th. Fast destroyers slipped down the slot in the darkness exactly as they had done on the runs of the Tokyo Express in the good months, and took off the men who could still be taken on. 10,652 men. That was the number Japan carried away from Guadalcanal. 4,935 on the first night. 3,742 on the second, 1,975 on the last. The sailors who reached down from the destroyer decks to help those men climb aboard were shocked at what they were told. Some of the men could not climb the cargo nets. They did not have the strength in their arms to pull themselves up. The sailors had to reach down and haul them onto the ships the way a stevedore hauls a sack of rice, because that was what these men now weighed. That was what was left of them. Ribs, eyes sunk into skulls, skin drawn tight over bone, uniforms that hung on frames that no longer filled them. 600 of these men would die before they ever received medical care. They had been kept alive on the island by will alone, and the moment the will was allowed to rest, the will let go. 3,000 more required extensive hospitals. Many of them would never fully recover. The malaria they carried in their blood would come back and back and back through the rest of their lives. And here is the thing about Operation Key that must be understood. The Americans did not know it was happening. Allied intelligence saw the increased shipping activity. Allied intelligence saw the destroyers moving in the slot. And Allied intelligence concluded wrongly that it was preparation for a new Japanese offensive. Nobody on the American side imagined that the Empire was pulling out. Because the Empire did not pull out. That was the point. Japanese armies did not withdraw. Everyone knew that. Later, Admiral Chester Nimitz would say that only the skill in keeping their plans disguised and the boldness in carrying them out had allowed the Japanese to withdraw at all. It was the one thing they did right in the entire campaign. On the 9th of February, 1943, at 25 minutes past 4 in the afternoon, Major General Alexander Patch, who had taken over the campaign from Vandegrift, sent a radio message to Admiral William Halsey. It contained two sentences. Total and complete defeat of Japanese forces on Guadalcanal affected 1625. That was it. That was the end. American troops moving into the abandoned Japanese positions in the days that followed saw things that they carried in their heads for the rest of their lives. Skeletons still holding rifles, diaries lying in the mud beside their owners, field hospitals full of the dead who had not been able to walk to the beach. Rows of unburied men, their bones showing through the fabric of what had been uniforms. Approximately 300 Americans and 20,000 Japanese are still listed as missing on that island to this day. Their remains were never recovered. The jungle keeps them. The numbers, when they were finally counted, told the size of the disaster. Of the roughly 36,000 Japanese troops who had fought on Guadalcanal, approximately 25,000 did not leave. More than three-quarters of them had not died from American bullets. They had died from starvation and disease. The Empire had lost the equivalent of 2 divisions to hunger and malaria on one island. 683 Japanese aircraft had been destroyed in the campaign, and with them a generation of veteran pilots the Empire could not replace. The naval aviation cadre that had gutted the Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor and swept the sky at the Coral Sea and at Midway was, by February of 1943, a hollowed-out ghost of what it had been 8 months before. American losses across the entire campaign, on land and at sea, were approximately 7,100 dead. Nearly 5,000 of those were sailors, drowned in the black water of Iron Bottom Sound. But the true casualty of Guadalcanal was not a man, it was an idea. Captain Toshikazu Ome, a former staff officer of the Imperial Japanese Navy, wrote about it years later in the pages of the United States Naval Institute Proceedings in January of 19. His verdict was quiet. Countermeasures taken by the Japanese against the American landing, he wrote, lacked thoroughness, owing to an underestimation of American fighting strength. Kawaguchi, the man who had brought his dress whites to the island, had already said it more bitterly, closer to the wound. Guadalcanal, he wrote, is no longer merely the name of an island in Japanese military history. It is the name of the graveyard of the Japanese army. And Vandegrift, the quiet Virginian who had watched the fleet steam away from him on the 9th of August and who had rebuilt everything from Japanese rice and coral sand, wrote his own verdict in a letter to Commandant Thomas Holcomb after the Tenaru. He was writing about the enemy. But if you read it carefully, you can hear him writing about his own men, too. I have never heard or read of this kind of fighting, he wrote. These people refused to surrender. The wounded wait until men come up to examine them and blow themselves and the other fellow to pieces with a hand grenade. They refused to surrender. Both sides did. That was what Guadalcanal was. 2 peoples, each of whom had been told by their own leaders that the other would fold, meeting on a sandbar and on a ridge and in the black water off Savo, and neither of them folding. One side had brought a doctrine. The other side brought a runway they could rebuild by afternoon. Doctrine lost. President Franklin Roosevelt, when the news of the November naval victories reached him, said it plainly. It would seem, he said, that the turning point in this war has at last been reached. He was right, but he was describing something larger than a turning point. He was describing the exact moment when a story the Empire of Japan had been telling itself about the American character, a story that had been printed in pamphlets and preached on radio and drilled into every man of the Imperial Army for a generation, finally died. Died in the mud on a ridge above Henderson Field. It died in the water off Savo. It died in the diary of a probationary officer named Nakamura, who wrote in his last entry that he hoped for a night attack because he wanted to eat the enemy's food. It died on the decks of the destroyers of Operation K, in the arms of the sailors who had to lift what was left of an army onto the ships one skeleton at a time. And it died in the silence of an emperor who asked quietly why his airfields took a month to build and heard no answer. Before Guadalcanal, Japanese officers had told their men that the American Marines they were about to face had been recruited from prisons and mental asylums. It was the only explanation they could come up with for the kind of enemy they had met on that sandbar in August. There was no room in the doctrine for what the Americans had actually turned out to be. So the doctrine invented an insult, and the doctrine sent more men. After Guadalcanal, the officers stopped offering explanations. There were none that fit. The men who came home to Japan on those 3 nights in February, the 10,652 who had been carried out of Starvation Island in the arms of horrified sailors, carried something else back with them. They carried the knowledge that the story they had been told was not true, that the enemy was not soft, that the enemy did not fold, that the enemy, in fact, healed faster than the Empire could break him, and rebuilt faster than the Empire could destroy, and fought on ground the Empire had chosen with a ferocity the Empire had believed impossible. They carried that knowledge for the rest of the war. Some of them carried it for the rest of their lives. 25 years after the last shot was fired on Guadalcanal, a Japanese doctor who had served as a military surgeon during the campaign returned to the island. He was an old man by now. He had watched his patients die in the jungle field hospitals for lack of anything at all, to give. He walked inland from the beach. He walked into the same jungle where his army had died, and there in the roots of a tree he found what the jungle had kept for him for a quarter of a century. A rusted mess kit, a boot heel, a single human tooth. He knelt in the mud. He was one of the first Japanese men to come back looking for them. He would not be the last. To this day, on the island now called Guadalcanal Province in the Solomon Islands, there are still American Marines, and there are still Japanese soldiers whose remains have never been recovered. 300 Americans, 20,000 Japanese. Their bones are in the earth, under the coconut palms, under the villages, under the schoolhouses. They are still there. And every year, on the 7th of August, small groups of veterans and their sons, and now their grandsons, American and Japanese together, gather on that beach. They lay wreaths in the water. They stand in silence. They do not speak much because there is not much left. What was decided on that beach was that spirit alone does not defeat steel, that a doctrine is not stronger than the men it sends into the fire, that the Marine who stood on the ridge that September night, tired and hungry, and asked for one more night, was fighting for something no pamphlet in Tokyo had ever understood. He was fighting for the man next to him, and that, in the end, was what the myth called. That was Guadalcanal. Rest easy.